Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Wade, and welcome to All of Us. All of Us is a place where I help my friends recount to remember the goodness and faithfulness of Christ. Everyday women just sharing the highs, the lows, the ups and downs, and everything in between. Today, I'm so excited because today is episode 12. 12 episodes. I cannot believe how God has grown all of us and shaped it. And I could not think of a better person to be with me on my 12th episode than my friend, Jenn Barrett. So, Jenn, hi.
Hi. So fun to be here from my bedroom. I told Rachel, I was like, we were having this huge storm and this was the best lighting in my house where it's so dark everywhere.
The things that we do for the good lighting, you know what I'm saying? Well,
exactly.
thank you for joining, even from your bedroom. She does work a whole bunch. I just want everyone to know that this is not like her just hanging out in her bed and just randomly took this call. So anyway, well, Jenn, could you introduce yourself to the All of Us family? Those that don't know you, could you just kind of shed a light on who you are, where you're from?
Yeah, my name is Jenn Barrett, and I live in Northwest Arkansas with my amazing husband, who I met on a blind date and married 2 years ago. He is a middle school teacher here. And then I have an organization called the Well Summit, and we host a retreat twice a year called Camp Well in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado. And that is how Rachel and I have become kindred sisters.
Yes.
Get to link arms with God's work together. So that is who I am and kind of why I'm here.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful, that we met through Camp Well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But tell us a little bit about how you know Jesus. That all of us is for the everyday woman of faith. And I think it's important that we know that history of how we came to know him.
Yeah. I grew up in a home where my mom loved the Lord so faithfully. I remember her on her couch reading her Bible, doing her Bible study every morning. And so she modeled that for me. And so at a young age, at 9, I came to know the Lord and just pursued him faithfully as a kid. I'll be honest that there were those high school, college, early adult years that were very filled very much with a lot of rule following and duty and kind of legalism, I would say, inside my faith. And in the kindness of the Lord, he kind of sanctified that in me by walking me through a really hard journey of a lot of brokenness and hurt and pain. And so I'm grateful for that. And so now I'm grateful to be able to look back and see a faith walk that has not been easy, but one that has continued to say that I believe God is who he says he is.
Yes.
I believe his word is what it says it is. And I believe that I am who he says I am. And that has been a steady constant in my life.
Yes. And, I think part of the reason why, Jenn, that I feel like we are kindred spirits is we have different stories, but a similar vein. And, I was raised in the church as well. I accepted Christ at 8 years old. But the way that I saw obedience and the way that I was following the Lord was more of a legalistic approach to having a relationship with Jesus. And I do think that I needed to have, for me, the walls had to come down for me to see that, the way that I was following the Lord was not a true, real relationship, with him. And it was all about the rules. And so that brings me to our topic today, because I have titled this Obedience Over Outcome. And those are words that I learned from you. But obedience, this topic of when I think about the word obedience, for me growing up, it was like, I'm not going to like anything that if you're asking me to be obedient, like that's a rule and I'm probably going to break it and I'm not perfect. And, I had this yucky feeling in my mouth when I think about the word obedience in my past life. Now, obviously I've matured in my faith and I see it much differently and partly because of you. But tell me about how did you grow up with the word obedience? What does that word mean to you? Could you define that for us?
Yeah, I love that you brought up how you viewed it before versus how you view it now, because I would say that same thing. I would say that legalism was driven by my desire to be obedient and get all the things right.
Yes, yes.
It was, but honestly, when I look back on that, I think it was in an effort to do two things. I think to control my life. Like if I just did things right, then I knew I was following the rules and I didn't ever have to wonder.
Right.
I think the other thing I realized I was doing was I was trying to control God. So if I was obedient, then he would do this.
Yes.
And so I look back now and I can see how that was a formula in my life. But then kind of breaking the bondage of legalism, you start to get a negative taste of it in your mouth, like the rules and the regulations and the restrictions. I looked up the definition of obedience in the dictionary because I was just curious. And it says compliance with an order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. Now, you read that and you're like, that sounds off. Like who wants to, I mean, and there are people who are like, you know, when we think about our kids being raised as kids, you're taught to obey authority.
Yeah.
And so I think for all of us, we have a different relationship with obedience. And I love that you asked that question. I think for me, the older I have gotten, I say that the other side of 40 is awesome. But it has come with obedience becoming easier and being faithful to the Lord has become easier because I've just more realized he's right. Like he knows best. He has my best interest at heart all the time. He is for me.
Yes.
And so if he's calling me to something or asking me to do something or inviting me into something, the older I've gotten, I've just realized he really knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
Yeah. Obedience has been redefined, I guess, for me, as I've gotten older, for sure.
For sure. And I feel that same way now, but I also like, and my husband and I, we feel this way that we have made so many mistakes when we tried to, you know, be the one in the driver's seat, when we have tried to rush things along, or like you mentioned, making our own way and trying to control God. We have made so many mistakes with money, with past relationships. I mean, I could go on and on to where now when we met and when we got married, we were like, God, your way is the only way. You know, like we are going to be obedient because we know what the pain is like on the other side of that. And I do think that, like you mentioned, that is a maturity in age, but also in spiritual formation and maturity in Christ. And so, yeah, we're all a work in progress, but yeah, I'm with you. It's like, I'm going to choose obedience. I'm going to choose obedience. You know, every time now. So, or at least most of the time. So talk about,
and that's it too, because I think that as we've gotten, for those of us who struggled with legalism, it was a lack of understanding of grace. And so I think that's a component that redefines obedience is when you have a deeper understanding of grace, it becomes less of a, if I mess up, I will be punished. Now, granted, there's consequence to our sin and disobedience, for sure. But I think that's the bondage of legalism, is a misunderstanding of grace. So I think that's a component of helping redefine obedience too.
That's so good, Jen. So good. So talk to us about the Well Summit and Camp Well. Like, how did this idea come about? I'm sure obedience had a lot to do with it. Tell us about Camp Well.
Yeah, I mean, probably over a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, I found myself becoming a conference junkie. I just loved going to conferences. I know some people hate them because there's so many people, but I don't know, they would always energize me, inspire me, encourage me, kind of reset me back on this path of like, you know, vision and direction and inspiration. And so I loved what happened to me and the community around that. And so as I just started going to more and more, I felt like there was a need for community for women who sat in the tension of feeling too much and not enough. And I would say that 10 plus years ago, I couldn't put language around that. I just felt the need for women. I just saw a lot of women in the tension of that and isolating themselves and desperately needing community. So I just had this idea to start a conference, but I kept running into roadblocks, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so the Lord was just like, I want you to take that idea and put it on the shelf. Like, I just really felt like he was saying, surrender this idea. I didn't feel like I was surrendering it to the point of never seeing it again. I can look back and say it was just on the shelf. And so for about 8 years, the Lord did some work in me. I struggled with comparison for sure. I'd look around at what everyone else was doing, specifically ministry wise, and thought they're doing it better. They're doing it bigger. What's the point? I struggled with wanting it to be from a production or visually or marketing wise, like this excellent thing. My background is marketing and design.
Yes.
And so I put on myself I kept waiting until it was awesome to do anything. And so I was paralyzed in that. There was obviously fear. So after about 8 years of wrestling with that, the Lord, I took that dream back off the shelf and it looked completely different. So it looked like what it is now, which is Camp Well, which is it's hosted twice a year in the mountains of Colorado. And it is 4 days for 40 women. And it is for those women who sit in the tension of feeling too much, not enough. And it is a space carved out where women can come. They don't feel alone anymore in their wrestling and processing. But it looks like we say, come with all your baggage. You know, some people are like, leave all of life and home at home. Right. And we say, no, just bring it. We're going to sort through it. We're going to sort through it all. And so we walk through, things like identity, gifts, strengths. We separate truth from lies. And the hope is that you leave with an understanding of how God has uniquely wired you to co-labor for kingdom work. So we're all in this together. Yes. And leave with that next right thing. It's not leaving with this big call on your life and what you're supposed to do for the rest of your life, but what is that next right thing? For some people, it is resting or waiting. For some of it is a teeny tiny step of obedience. And so we just love creating space for that to happen.
Yeah. And, Jen, I think there's two things that I want to pull out from what you just said. One is that you struggled a lot with comparison. And, you have good friends that are in ministry and are doing events, and so that's right in front of your face, of what somebody else is doing. But I love how you have always said this, and you taught me this as well, is that, there's enough room in the kingdom for all of us. And in my quiet time this morning, God brought me to Hebrews 13. And it says, may the God of peace equip you with everything good for doing his will. And may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ. And that spoke so much to the topic today, because I was thinking about how everything that he puts in us, if we're using it for his goodwill, that there's plenty out there for us to do. And as long as we are working within our giftings there and working within our lanes, and I'm not saying, I want to be Jen over here, but I'm right here being obedient to whatever he asked me to do. There's space and there's so much peace that comes from that. And one of the things that you mentioned about Camp Well is some people don't know why they come. Some people come just for rest. And I was a person that did not have a dream coming into Camp Well. I wanted rest. I was a mom that had 2 young kids. I was still breastfeeding when I came to Camp Well. But I knew that I was on the verge of burnout, and I knew that I just needed a refuge. And little did I know that God not only gave me peace and rest when I was at Camp Well, but he allowed me to pull back these layers that had been covering me from being free. It was almost like I was in shackles walking into Camp Well. And little things that I journaled about at Camp Well, he would speak to me on those, whether it was someone telling me that, they loved my hair and they thought my hair was pretty, and knowing that I struggle with identity, like how I looked and felt, to me feeling like I was, completely just over, like, just in ministry, but just so tired and feeling like I was taking care of everybody and everything else. And I had a roommate that literally asked me if I wanted her to tuck me into bed. And I don't even think I've ever told you that story. But it was just, I mean, I'm talking such detailed things, Jen, that I was like, God, you care for me. And that sounds so silly, but when it's so detailed like that, when I have felt like no one sees me, no one takes care of me, that gesture of her asking to tuck me into bed, or Hannah, setting a place setting, to make with my name on it, to make me feel like I was seen. I mean, all of that was a part of him allowing me to see that I was important, that he had a plan for me, and I could walk out of Campwell free into obedience. But I think those shackles had to come off for me to be obedient.
Well, and that makes me so teary, because I remember when Campwell was born, there was never the value or purpose or intention to make sure people felt seen by the Lord. Mm-hmm. But after that first one, it is now a key part of what Campwell is about. And that was God's doing. That wasn't even an intention of doing this work.
Yeah.
But a fruit of doing the work, creating the space, helping people find freedom.
Yeah.
Pulling all that back. God's been looking at you the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
He's always seen you. But we are so clouded and living in a fog,
right,
of striving and comparing and exhaustion, that we can't see that he sees us.
Yeah.
And that has just become a beautiful, surprising byproduct of the work at Campwell. And I love hearing your story, like even down to someone saying, like, caring for you in that way.
Yeah.
Is just so sweet.
It is. And, you mentioned too, I mean, with obedience, God can give us a dream and tell us to do something, but sometimes we want to hurry up and go. And you mentioned that you had to, that Campwell was shelved for a little bit, and that too is obedience. So it's like he gave you this dream, but then there was more obedience that came with that, of like, oh, no, wait a little bit longer. It's not quite time yet. And I think that that's important for us to say and to point out, that being obedience can look like sometimes some starts and stops. But as long as we're leaning into him, he's going to tell us when that door it's time to go, or when it's time to pause. We've had friends that have paused their ministries that they were doing, and then they were, doing really, really well. And we're like, you know what? I need a break right now. Like God's telling me to wait. And so, being obedient does not mean full steam ahead right away. And I definitely want to point that out to people. So also, Jen, I mean, what was it like leading up to Campwell, your very first Campwell? Because it's like, okay, now I'm being obedient, but there had to be, outside of the shelving it for a little bit, the 10 years or whatever you said, like, what other roadblocks, happened right before that very first one, where you're like, okay, I'm doing this, and then, anything happen in your life?
Yeah, it's funny, because to segue what you just said about timing and waiting, he wastes nothing.
Yes.
Ever.
Yes.
And I remember being in the middle of the waiting, thinking, I'm holding back the Lord. And so I started feeling shame in that, like, Jen, just go do it.
Mm-hmm.
You're holding up what God wants to do. And I do think there's a moment of that where you're like, okay, just go be obedient. But looking back, and this is part of the story, is the year leading up to Campwell was God's exact perfect timing for launching what Campwell is now. In the beginning days of planning it, it was a lot of like, how in the world do you start a retreat? And so I did all this research on literally like logistics of an offsite retreat in another city. And it was things like, make sure it's near a major airport and in a big city the first time. It's got to be easy for people to get to. But all in my head, I kept thinking, this is supposed to be in the mountains. Like that was the one consistent part of the vision. And so I remember going to Denver, Colorado, site visits, looking for a hotel, easy access to the airport, and come to find out I missed the point where the ballroom in the hotel had 0 windows.
Oh
And I
boy.
didn't catch that part until we're literally sitting there week of, and I'm like, what have I done? We're here in Colorado. We might as well be, in
Anywhere.
anywhere in the
Yeah.
country.
Anywhere USA.
There's no window. So I joke, I'm like, go ugly early. You never know what
Yes.
God's going to do with it.
I love
But I had no loans, no nothing. I just had to believe that God was going to provide 40 women. And that time we only had 30 coming.
Wow.
And it's a lot of just trusting and trying to be wise. And I mean, the people that came around this vision and got it off the ground and birthed it, just like friends and people, friends of friends that I didn't know. And then 5 weeks before this first camp, we did sell out. There were 30 women coming from all over the country. I would say most of them I did not know, had never met before. And a lot of people ask this question, like, how did you get people there if nobody knew about it? I think that was part of what God uses. He uses our minimal morsels.
Yes.
And for about 3 years before that, I mean, I think we had an Instagram account and a newsletter and a blog. And I had written this like self-published devotional. So like there were very little, there were some little morsels that we had just been faithful in the little things, I guess was the lesson.
Good. That's good.
For 3 years. So like there was some long obedience for sure. But 5 weeks before the very first Camp Well, my husband, who I'd been married to for 15 years, left me for the third time. And here Camp Well was impending. Like I couldn't change the date. I couldn't cancel. People who paid in full deposits for a hotel. And I never questioned canceling it, but I thought, what in the world is God doing? And I showed up in that space that first day, and the Holy Spirit I knew I was supposed to share, that part of my story. I only spent, maybe 3 minutes sharing that part of my story, but I knew it mattered, but I did not know how much it mattered to the women in that room. And, you and I know this, but vulnerability breeds vulnerability.
Yes, it does.
I am convinced that God waited to launch Camp Well in the middle of that cross section of my life where a 10-year dream was being threatened by my circumstances. And I believe that was God's intention all along.
Jenn.
To lead out of a place where I stood there and said, look, the enemy is threatening to convince me that I am disqualified, that I don't have the capacity to love you guys well or lead you guys well. But God, for some reason, He saw fit to put me here in this moment. So it is not without mistake, and He wastes nothing for sure.
That's so true, Jenn. And, I think that brings up a great point of when God gives us a dream or a vision and we step out in obedience, like there's going to be roadblocks. There's going to perhaps be setbacks. There's going to be just the voices in our head. I mean, there's going to be the fears, the anxiety, life stuff that just happens. And to be willing to say, God, no, but I trust you. And I'm going to continue to step out regardless of how I feel and what I see. And pushing past that is really hard to do. But I also want to point out that we don't go at this life alone. And you had a lot of amazing people around you that loved you, that were with you, that not only stood with you in this dream, but just in life, and prayed for you and pushed you through. And I think that anything that God gives us, it is so much better when we do it with other people. In fact, I don't think that He gives us anything just for ourselves to do on our own. And I know Camp Well is that for you. And I know that all of us is this for me. He gives, I had the morsel of an idea, but what this is today and the help, from friends and family and people in my life that have allowed this to even happen, it would not be what it is today without other people. So, community.
It's so true though. And I'll be honest, because a lot of people see parts of my story now in my community in Campwell and our community at Campwell. Yeah. And what I want to be really clear about is I did not have that until probably 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's good to point out.
And it was a conviction. There was some confession, and it was intention to get to where community is for me today. So I do want to say that, because I think some people listening or watching, might be like, well, I don't have that. I don't have community like that where people would hold up my arms and come around me and link arms with me to go do what God's asked me to do. And I used to not also. So if that is missing, pray, because God designed us for community. It is his intention on this earth. So it is something he wants for you.
Yes. And I would also add to that, I had people around, but there were some people that didn't need to be there in that season. And so one of the prayers that I always pray, me and my husband, is, God, bring the right people in that need to be in, and God, take the ones out that need to be out. Not everybody can go with us into the next season. And so you may be on the other side of that, where you're like, I've got a lot of people around me, but I don't know if I really have that true, my pastor calls it the wisdom table around me that is really going to be seeking God and is for me. So I think that that's important too, is praying that prayer of like, God, bring the right people into my life, and if there's some that I need to love along, as I say, then let them go, So Jen, I mean, Campwell obviously was a big step for you. It was a major act of obedience, continued obedience that hasn't stopped. That's still happening. But what does that look like in your everyday? I mean, I'm sure that there's other small everyday ways that you're continuously faced with having to be obedient. What are some of those for you? And what are some struggles that you just honestly have with being obedient sometimes?
Yeah, I'll just be honest right now in this season. This year has been really emotionally difficult and heavy for me and for, my dear friends around me. And when COVID happened, I'll just be so honest. I'm an Enneagram 7. So if anyone knows anything about, 7s, we're really enthusiastic and optimistic. Yes. And last fall, late fall, I had reached a place of just overwhelm and knew the Lord was calling me to Sabbath rest for sure, and understanding what that really looked like. I had worked through a lot of striving and performance years ago. Like that had been something God had sanctified me from, but I still wasn't, in the midst of kind of slowing down and simplifying, I wasn't resting also. And so last fall was a lot of learning that. And then when COVID happened, I thought, I've got this. I'm going to make the most of COVID. It's not going to take me down. I'm going to be optimistic. And I think it was like a straw that broke the camel's back. I have not been well. And so I think for me, obedience some days is those really, and I'm just going to be honest. I'm not doing it well. Even what I feel like is some small obedience things, like there are days I don't feel like getting out of bed.
Sure.
And I want to be honest. I just want to speak into this.
Yes.
There is, and this will make me emotional, but there are seasons of grief and hard and depression. I will call it what it is. There are seasons of that. And so I just want to say for someone who may be in a season of that, and you hear this conversation about obedience, do not hear that you are not doing enough.
Right.
Doing the right things. I think obedience sometimes looks like just believing God is who he says he is.
Yes.
And he is there even in the days that we believing, that obedience and believing. Sometimes I think it is as simple as that. Like me believing today that God is steady and faithful even when I am not.
Yes.
And so obedience is not always about doing something.
Yes.
Physical, tangible, active. Obedience can look like rest. It can look like believing God is who he says he is and his word is what it says it is, and I am who he says I am. Like, sometimes that is obedience for me.
Yeah. And you're not alone in that, Jen. I mean, I think that we've all struggled in some way, but as you were speaking, I just kept thinking like, yeah, me too. Like, there's been a lot of days where I'm like, God, I just need to believe that you are who you say you are, you know? And it's just been me like leaning into his word and being like, and stripping back the layers. And I think that this pandemic has done that for all of us in some way, shape, or form, but just truly just saying, God, you know, I need to just be obedient to like your word is true and that you love me. You know, there's been days where I'm just like, you love me, you know, you're there, and being obedient to that. Yeah, it's not about striving for sure.
Yeah. And I add that other part of it, you know, to choose obedience over outcome part, the over outcome part. Sometimes that looks like, you know, it's saying that I'm going to be faithful and obedient to the Lord, regardless of what he does with it. The outcome is on him. It's for him to decide. It could mean success or failure. It could mean starting or stopping something, like you said. Outcome could also not be in our vision. I think about, you know, Abraham and Moses and all the things they didn't see outcome-wise.
Yes.
But yet they maintained this story of faithful obedience. And so, not perfection, we know that through God's word, but this steadiness of obedience and faithfulness, and yet there were things unseen to them. The outcome of their faithfulness, a lot of times they didn't see, a lot of times we don't see. And a lot of times outcome, again, doesn't look like something tangible. Me resting, I'm not going to necessarily see much outcome from that other than maybe the ability to show up for someone tomorrow because I'm not tired, or answering that phone call. Or so that whole obedience over outcome, that outcome part, I think helps us show up to obedience and be faithful, even when we don't see why or what happens after that.
So good. This has been so good today, Jen. So glad we've had this conversation. So as we close up, I would love to just ask you 3 just rapid fire questions. I do it with all my guests. I don't know. I love it. Maybe no one else loves it, but I do. And so finish these statements for me. God is
faithful. So faithful.
Amen. And obedience over outcome because
he knows best.
Good. And all of us are better when
Jesus is better. He's better than approval, better than success, better than striving, better than performing, and just better than anything we're walking through.
So good. Jenn Jet Barrett, I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for doing this interview today, but not more than that, for your obedience. Your obedience has led to freedom for so many women, including myself. If I told you this before we even got on, that if we hadn't become friends after Camp Well, like that's the bonus and the icing on the cake for me, is to call you friend. But walking away from that experience, God freed me, and I was able to continue to take steps of obedience, and I will, but it's because of you pushing through, pushing past those setbacks, pushing past the discomfort, the hurt, the pain, the not knowing the outcome, that led to me and so many others being free. So thank you for being obedient, and thank you for continuing to just show up. And I want to encourage you and tell you that you are enough, and this world is better because you're in it. So thank you, my friend. I love you very much.
Thank you for saying yes to every time I ask you to come along on the ride.
Yes.
So it is
yes and amen. Yes and amen. All right, Jen. All right. Thank you guys for joining us today. You can find more about Jen on the blog, and you can catch up with her on our Instagram page. I will put in the notes how you can also connect with Jen personally, whether that's through the Well Summit or her personal page. So we love you guys, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Bye.